Coming up next on The Hunt for Amazing Treasures. 70 years ago, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. Now an incredible discovery in the Arizona desert could change history.
Donald Albert Hall was one of the 20th century's great aeronautical engineers, and most likely you've never heard of him. But I guarantee you've heard of the plane he designed.
The Spirit of St. Louis. It was 1926 and a race was on. A huge cash award had been offered by a French-American industrialist for the first non-stop flight over the Atlantic. The competition was drawing the best-known pilots in both the U.S. and Europe. Some had already tried and failed. Charles Lindbergh, an unknown 27-year-old airmail pilot from St. Louis, was convinced he was the man who could do it. Totally consumed by the challenge, he raised over $10,000 for the construction of a plane specially engineered for a transatlantic flight, but was having difficulty finding someone to build it. Eventually, he turned to a small company in San Diego, Ryan Aviation.
He needed a company that might match his own level in the world of aviation, and that they would really put out for him. And so he sent a telegram off to Ryan. He inquired if they were able to manufacture an airplane that could make such a trip from New York to Paris, and he asked them how much it would cost and how long it would take.
Lindbergh had a clear idea of the plane he wanted to fly solo across the Atlantic, and he wanted it built fast. The race was on, and he had no time to lose. But Lindbergh was no engineer. Fortunately, Ryan Aircraft had just hired a young aeronautical wizard as their chief engineer. Upon first meeting, Lindbergh knew instinctively that Don Hall was the man who could translate his concepts into a plane that could fly.
And I think a lot of what impressed him about Donald Hall was simplicity again. And there was a great sincerity about the man as well. And there were very few minutes of cordialities. They got right down to business.
The greatest stunt of all begins on the misty morning of May 20th, as a young airmail pilot hastens to be the first to fly non-stop from New York to Paris.
3 months later, Charles Lindbergh stepped into history, and his plane followed him there, all the way to the Smithsonian. But history seemed to have forgotten about Don Hall. However, there was someone who wanted to know more about him. Someone who had never met him, but nevertheless felt a strong bond with him. That person was Don Hall's grandson, Nova.
I never knew him. I mean, he passed away in '69. I was born in '76. There was no way I could know about him.
Nova knew his grandfather had worked with Lindbergh, but not much more of the family history, because his grandfather was from another world, one that Nova's own father, Don Jr., had left behind. As his name might suggest, Nova Hall was raised in the counterculture, helping out with the family's natural herb business while they constantly moved from place to place.
So we were preparing for our 14th move, and at that point we were just going through the garage trying to see what we wanted to keep, what we didn't want to keep, because we were about to move into a much smaller place. I moved a few things, and then there it was. I just saw the initials. As soon as I saw it, I started thinking, I want to see what's in there. It was a locked chest, just like I had always wanted to find. This was a really well-made trunk, and from the weathered look on it outside, it had been around and gone through a lot of stuff. Trying to open it initially was just, it was real tough. I didn't know what to do. I think I tried a smaller crowbar initially, didn't work. And after a few tries, it popped open. And once I opened it, the first thing I remember was the smell of old papers. And I knew that smell at that point.
The trunk was a treasure trove of enormous historical importance. Inside was a complete record of the design and construction of the world's most famous airplane. Don Hall had saved everything: drawings, photos, rare film clips, letters, and no one knew any of it existed until now.
I think everybody always wants to find a treasure chest. It's It's probably ingrained in us in some way, and I'd found mine.
The contents of the trunk not only told Nova more about his grandfather, it held a definitive record of one of history's forgotten byways.
This was absolutely a treasure. For a lot of reasons. This material is incredibly important to aviation history. We uncovered a lot of information about the process of designing the Spirit of St. Louis that we didn't know, or maybe we didn't know as completely as we now know.
This trunk held all the secrets, all the details, all the records of the moment-by-moment decision-making that led to the creation of this unique aircraft.
And you get a sense of that when you look at the material in the collection, when you see the wing design with the fingerprints all over it. That is just a sketch. It's not even a professional engineering design because they didn't have time to produce an exact engineering design of the wing. He had to just kind of scratch it out on the board.
Hall moved a second desk into his cramped office for Lindbergh, and the two men were joined at the hip for the 60 days it took to construct the plane.
Once they had agreed on the general design of the plane, Donald Hall just stayed up for days. I mean, at one point, 36 straight hours, really designing the plane, because they couldn't get on with the actual manufacturing of the plane until Hall had done his work.
Piece by piece, the contents of the trunk opened a unique window into aviation history, documenting the construction of the plane and providing an insight into the life of an unsung American hero, and at the same time, drawing a picture of the man for his grandson.
It became alive, and I saw what he did, what a human being who was 28, only a few years older than I am right now, was able to produce when nobody had ever done anything like that.
Hall's calculations determined that Lindbergh needed at least 400 gallons of fuel to make it across, and he designed a plane that could carry the load. In fact, some called it a flying gas tank.
You can see Donald Albert Hall trying to sneak in gas tanks into the wing, right? We need as much gas as possible to get across the ocean, so not only did he make this huge fuselage, he stuck them in the wings, but again, you see their fingerprints all over it, you see pinholes, you see it's a working model.
And I think that's one of the other interesting things about the design of the Spirit of St. Louis, that Lindbergh and Hall were really working so much together. It's almost as though Hall were designing a glove to fit over the hand that was Lindbergh. This was a plane literally designed for this pilot and all his experience.
The hundreds of photos found in the trunk cleared up some long unanswered questions about the plane's origins. One example involved a problem no one had anticipated.
The New York to Paris project had to have a much greater wingspan to support this excessively large gas tank and to help get it off the ground. And so when they built the plane inside the warehouse, they added 10 extra feet or so, not realizing that that would make it impossible to get it out the traditional warehouse doors.
And they could then hoist it out onto a railway car that they could push along some siding right up against the building. Then they would get a derrick that would lift the wing onto a waiting truck, and then they would cart the wing out along with the fuselage out to where they were going to test the plane.
But perhaps the most amazing item discovered inside Donald Albert Hall's monogram memory chest was a solitary can of film, with footage never before seen in public and missing for almost 75 years. Though the old nitrate-based film was badly deteriorated, there was enough of it left to reveal the first flight ever of the Spirit of St. Louis.
When Lindbergh took this plane up for the first time, it was one of the most thrilling flights he ever took. Not just because this plane had been built for him, but he had never been in a plane, he said, that lifted off so quickly. It was kind of magical for him. I mean, this plane really worked. And he immediately got the feel of it, the hang of it, and it was all quite wonderful. And he went up and he flew over Ryan, he flew over the factory, and he tipped his wings and did a salute to all the people who had worked on the plane. And they spent the day doing more tests, each test with a little more fuel, a little less fuel. And at the end of the day, the whole team, everyone who had worked on the plane, came out and they did a team photo, just lining up, going really from one end of one wing to the other.
Soon after the test flights, Lindbergh, worried that someone else would beat him to the punch, hurriedly flew to the East Coast to prepare for the transatlantic flight.
There are a few moments in every century that become our milestones. And Lindbergh's flight from New York to Paris was one of those. And in that instant, the Earth became smaller. And for Charles Lindbergh, of course, everything changed. This rather obscure, shy Midwesterner suddenly became not just the most famous man on Earth, but the most celebrated living person who ever lived.
I had this feeling that I finally had met my grandfather. He was alive, and I started seeing him instead of just the spirit. At that point, everything came together. The whole story started to make sense. And now I truly believe that I know my grandfather, even though I've never met him.
I think this entire collection, the papers, the drawings, the photographs that belong to Donald Albert Hall give us a great insight. It's a great overview, not just of this one particular project, but of the whole career of one of the country's most important aviation engineers. Lindbergh had the drive, had the focus, had the aeronautical knowledge, but Hall was the engineer, the one with the nuts and bolts ability to craft the machine, to make the machine that Lindbergh could then fly across the ocean.